My name is Emma Carter, I'm 29, and I've spent 7 years working as a fundraising manager for a nonprofit that provides housing assistance to families in crisis. The kind of work where you learn to read a donor's hesitation the way most people read a contract. Instantly noticing the exact moment generosity needs a little more context to become a commitment, and knowing precisely how to provide it. I know how to build a case for support, so airtight that even skeptical board members find themselves reaching for their checkbooks. I did not expect to need that same skill defending my own right to my own life at my parents' dinner table on an ordinary Sunday that started like every other Sunday before it. "We've already discussed it as a family," my mother, Olivia, said, setting down a serving dish with the same brisk, satisfied efficiency she brought to every holiday meal, as though she were simply announcing the menu rather than my entire future. "Once the baby comes, you'll move in with Daniel and Jessica for a few months to help out. You don't have a real life to disrupt anyway, sweetheart. It's not like you've got a husband or kids waiting on you." The table didn't go silent. Exactly. My brother Daniel kept eating, unbothered, the specific, comfortable ease of a man who has never once had to worry about whether a room would side with him. Jessica, 7 months pregnant with their 5th child, offered me a small, grateful smile, as though I'd already agreed to something rather than simply been informed of it. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, doing the same careful, professional arithmetic I do at work when a pledge doesn't match the donor's actual capacity, except this time the numbers belonged to my own life. 7 years building a career, a mortgage I paid entirely on my own, a life my mother had just dismissed in a single sentence as not real enough to matter. If you've ever had your entire adult life erased in one sentence by someone who was supposed to be proud of it, I need you to stay with me, because this story does not end where my mother expected it to. I want to explain what "you don't have a real life" actually meant in my family, because I don't think that dinner table carries its full weight without the 7 years of context sitting underneath it. I was the daughter who left home at 18 and built everything myself. The apartment, then the career, then the house I'd bought 2 years earlier, with a down payment I'd saved for personally, dollar by dollar, while my brother Daniel had been handed a down payment on his first house as a wedding gift and had called my parents, at minimum, twice a month ever since, for one financial rescue or another. I understood, sitting at that table, that my independence had never actually registered with my mother as an achievement. It had registered as evidence that I was available, unmarried, childless, financially stable, and therefore, in her particular calculus, the family member with the fewest legitimate excuses not to be useful whenever Daniel's life required managing. "It's just a few months," my father, Richard, added quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. The specific, practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 30 years avoiding conflict with his wife by simply agreeing with whatever she'd already decided. "Your mother's right that it would really help them out." If you've ever watched a parent who avoids conflict enable a decision they clearly weren't comfortable with, simply because disagreeing would have been harder than staying quiet, comment "I know" that silence below. This story is for you. Daniel finally looked up from his plate, wiping his mouth with the particular unbothered ease of a man who had never once had to build his own case for anything in his life. "Look, Em, I know it's a lot to ask," he said, in a tone that suggested he understood the weight of the request while doing absolutely nothing to actually lighten it. "But Jessica's exhausted. We're stretched thin with 4 kids already. And honestly, you're kind of in the best position out of anyone in this family to help. You don't have a mortgage tying you down the way we do. You don't have kids of your own pulling at you. It just makes sense." "I have a mortgage, Daniel," I said. "I bought my house myself 2 years ago, with a down payment I saved for over 5 years. I have a full-time career I've spent 7 years building. Neither of those things disappeared because you decided they were less important than yours." He shrugged, unbothered, The specific, practiced deflection of someone who had spent his entire life being reassured by our parents that whatever he wanted mattered more than whatever anyone else had already built. I'm just saying, your job's not like mine. Nobody's going to miss a fundraiser as much as clients would miss an accountant. It's not the same kind of pressure. I sat with that comment for a long moment,
understanding with a clarity that had nothing to do with the specific insult and everything to do with the pattern underneath it. Exactly how thoroughly my brother had spent his entire adult life measuring his own obligations against everyone else's convenience, and finding every single time that everyone else's convenience simply had to yield. If you've ever had a sibling dismiss your entire career as less important than theirs, using the exact confidence of someone who's never once had to defend that assumption, comment, "The audacity is exhausting," below. I want to explain what "you don't have a real life" actually meant in my family, because I don't think that dinner table carries its full weight without the 7 years of context sitting underneath it. I was the daughter who left home at 18 and built everything myself: the apartment, then the career, then the house I'd bought 2 years earlier with a down payment I'd saved for personally, dollar by dollar, while my brother Daniel had been handed a down payment on his first house as a wedding gift and had called my parents, at minimum, twice a month ever since for one financial rescue or another. I understood, sitting at that table, that my independence had never actually registered with my mother as an achievement. It had registered as evidence that I was available, unmarried, childless, financially stable, and therefore, in her particular calculus, the family member with the fewest legitimate excuses not to be useful whenever Daniel's life required managing. I thought, sitting there, about every holiday over the past decade where Daniel's growing family had been celebrated as an expanding blessing, while my own promotions, my own house, my own carefully built financial independence had been mentioned, if at all, in the same breath as a gentle, disappointed question about when I might settle down properly myself, as though a mortgage, a stable career, and a decade of self-sufficiency somehow counted for less than a wedding ring and a nursery. "It's just a few months," my father Richard added quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, the specific practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 30 years avoiding conflict with his wife by simply agreeing with whatever she'd already decided. "Your mother's right that it would really help them out." If you've ever watched a parent who avoids conflict enable a decision they clearly weren't comfortable with, simply because disagreeing would have been harder than staying quiet. Comment, "I know that silence," below. Jessica spoke up for the first time that evening, her hand resting on her pregnant belly with the specific practiced gentleness of someone who understood exactly how sympathetic that gesture would land. "I really am struggling, Emma," she said, her voice carrying a soft, wounded quality that I recognized, even in the moment, as considerably more calculated than genuinely fragile. "I know it's a big ask, but you've always been the strong one in this family. I don't know who else I'd even turn to." I looked at her carefully, understanding, with the same professional instinct I bring to reading a donor's actual motivations underneath their stated ones, that "you've always been the strong one" had never once, in this family, functioned as a compliment. It functioned as a job assignment, delivered with just enough warmth to make refusing it feel like abandoning someone who needed me, regardless of whether the need was actually as urgent or as fairly distributed, as everyone at that table wanted me to believe. "I haven't agreed to anything," I said, keeping my voice level, the same calm, measured register I use when a donor pushes back on a proposal I've spent weeks preparing. "This is the first I'm hearing about any of this." "Emma, Don't make this difficult, my mother said, her warmth cooling instantly into something sharper. Daniel and Jessica have 4 children already, and a 5th on the way. You have a house with extra rooms and a flexible enough job. Family helps family. I don't understand why this needs to be a whole conversation. Because nobody asked me, I said. You told everyone I'd already agreed. Who else knows about this? The pause that followed told me everything before my mother answered. I may have mentioned it to your Aunt Carol, she said, with the specific breezy dismissal of someone who understood, even as she said it, that she'd already tried to make the decision unrefusable before I'd even heard about it. And a few others. It's not a secret, Emma. It's simply what this family needs right now. I sat back in my chair, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my mother had already spent weeks quietly building consensus around a plan involving my entire life, without once considering that consulting me might be a necessary first step rather than an inconvenient formality. I left dinner early that night,
claiming an early morning meeting that wasn't strictly true, and I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for a long time before starting the engine, replaying the entire conversation, doing the same careful accounting I do at work when a proposal doesn't add up to the story I've been told about it. 7 years of building a career. A house I'd bought entirely on my own. A family who had, apparently, already decided all of it counted for less than my brother's convenience, and had told extended relatives as much before I'd ever been given the chance to agree or refuse. I thought about every quiet moment over the years when I'd absorbed a small slight without saying anything. A birthday overshadowed by one of Daniel's announcements, a promotion mentioned briefly at dinner before the conversation pivoted back to whatever Daniel needed help with that month. A decade of learning without ever being told outright that my accomplishments were simply expected to make room for my brother's needs whenever the two happened to compete for attention in the same room. If you've ever sat in a car outside your parents' house, replaying a conversation that finally made an old pattern impossible to keep excusing, comment, "I've had that drive home too," below. Chapter 2 is where I start finding out exactly how far this plan actually goes. I didn't sleep much that first night, lying awake running the same careful accounting I do at work when a proposal doesn't match the story I've been told about it. By the following morning, I understood I needed more than my own memory of that dinner table if I was ever going to make anyone in my family actually reckon with what they'd done. I started, without fully deciding to, the same methodical documentation habit that had built my entire career. Dates, direct quotes, screenshots, the careful, unglamorous work of building a record nobody could later argue their way around. If you've ever started documenting a painful conversation, not because you had a plan yet, but because some instinct told you you'd need it later, comment, "That instinct is always right," below. This is where I started actually looking for the truth. The first real crack in the story appeared 4 days later when my cousin Melissa texted me, casually, congratulating me on finally getting your own place with Daniel and Jessica, a phrase specific enough that I understood immediately it hadn't come from any conversation I'd been part of. I asked her carefully where she'd heard that, and what she sent back stopped me cold. A screenshot of a family group chat I wasn't included in, one my mother had apparently created months earlier, where Daniel had written, 3 weeks before that dinner, "Mom, once you get Emma on board, we're thinking she just moves into the guest suite here, so she's around full-time. Saves her a mortgage payment, too, if she wants to rent her place out." I sat with that message for a long time, understanding with a coldness that had nothing to do with the early autumn chill outside, exactly how far in advance this plan had actually been built, and exactly how little any of it had ever included the possibility that I might simply say no. If you've ever discovered a conversation about your own future happening in a group chat you weren't even invited to, comment, "That's a whole different level of betrayal," below. Melissa sent me more over the following days, screenshots she'd been quietly collecting once she understood how blindsided I actually was, each one adding another layer to a plan that had clearly been developing for months, rather than the sudden, well-intentioned request my mother had tried to present at dinner. My mother, in one exchange, had written to my Aunt Carol, "Emma doesn't have kids of her own to worry about, so honestly, this works out well for everyone. She can always find another house later, once things settle down." Daniel, in another, had specifically discussed the possibility of having me cover a portion of the household's grocery and utility costs while I lived there, framing it, in his own words, as fair, since she'll be eating and using electricity too. I found one more exchange particularly difficult to read, a message from Jessica to my mother dated nearly 2 months before that dinner. "Honestly, if Emma moves in full-time, we probably don't even need to think about daycare for the older kids once the baby comes. That's basically a full salary we're saving." Reading that, I understood, with a clarity that landed considerably heavier than anything Daniel had written, that I had never actually been invited into this plan as a beloved aunt, willing to help. I had been budgeted, line by line, as a cost-saving measure, discussed with the same detached, practical calculation my own nonprofit uses when evaluating whether a grant justifies its administrative overhead. If you've ever discovered you'd been discussed in someone else's private messages, less like a person and more like a line item on a budget, comment "That's a specific kind of dehumanizing" below. I want to explain what building this evidence actually felt like, because I don't think the case I eventually assembled carries its real weight without understanding how much it cost me to keep functioning normally at work and at family gatherings while quietly absorbing proof of exactly how little my own life had ever mattered to the people constructing this plan. I kept a private folder, backed up separately, organized the same careful way I organize a grant proposal. Every screenshot dated, every conversation cross-referenced, building toward something I still hadn't fully decided what to do with yet. If you've ever had to keep functioning normally in front of people while quietly building proof of exactly how little you'd ever mattered to them, comment "That's its own exhausting performance" below. My mother called me twice that week, her voice carrying the same brisk, managing warmth from the dinner table, checking in on how I was feeling about everything, language that made it sound as though the only outstanding question was my emotional readiness rather than my actual consent. I answered carefully both times, giving nothing away about what Melissa had already shown me, understanding that whatever I eventually did with this evidence would land considerably harder if I let the full plan keep developing in the open first, rather than tipping my hand before I had everything documented. I met Melissa for coffee that weekend, needing, more than I expected to, the specific relief of talking to someone in this family who actually saw the situation clearly. "I almost didn't say anything," she admitted. "I didn't want to start drama, but watching everyone talk about your life like it was already settled, without you in the room, it didn't sit right with me. I figured you deserved to know what was actually being planned." "Thank you for telling me," I said, and I meant it more than the words probably conveyed. I don't think I'd have understood how far this actually went without seeing it in their own words. If you've ever had one family member break rank simply because something didn't sit right with them, even at the risk of starting drama, comment "Those people matter more than they know" below. I want to explain what the following 2 weeks actually looked like, because I don't think the case I eventually built carries its full weight without understanding how much I was still, even then, quietly hoping my family might simply reconsider on their own once I'd made my refusal clear enough. I told my mother directly, in a private phone call, that I would not be moving in with Daniel and Jessica, would not be quitting or reducing my job, and would not be contributing financially to their household. Her response confirmed everything Melissa's screenshots had already shown me. "You're being incredibly selfish, Emma," she said. "This family has always shown up for each other." I don't understand why you suddenly think your career is more important than your own nephew. I never said my nephew wasn't important, I said, keeping my voice level. I said I never agreed to become an unpaid live-in nanny while also covering household expenses in a home that isn't mine. Those are very different things, Mom. The silence on the line told me she hadn't expected me to know that specific detail yet, and I understood, in that pause, exactly how much confirmation I'd just received without needing to reveal a single screenshot. Daniel called me directly a few days later, his tone considerably less relaxed than it had been at dinner. The specific edge of a man who understood something had shifted but couldn't quite identify what. "Mom says you're being difficult about this," he said. "I don't get it, Em. We're not asking for anything crazy. Jessica's exhausted, the kids need help, and you're acting like we're trying to steal from you. You discussed having me cover groceries and utilities in a house that isn't mine," I said. "You called it fair, since she'll be eating and using electricity too." Those were your exact words, Daniel. The pause on his end was longer than my mother's had been, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier ease entirely. "How do you know what I said in a private conversation?" "Because apparently it wasn't as private as you assumed," I said. "I'd be careful about what you say in writing going forward if you're planning on continuing to discuss my life without me in the room." He didn't have an answer for that, and I hung up understanding, with a clarity that had been building for days, exactly how much this family had assumed my consent could simply be arranged around me, quietly, without ever actually needing my participation until the plan was too far along to easily refuse. I called a colleague from work that evening, someone I trusted enough to talk through the situation honestly, mostly needing an outside perspective to confirm I wasn't overreacting to something that might, in a different family, have simply been a clumsy but well-meaning request. "This isn't clumsy," she told me once I'd walked her through the screenshots. "Clumsy is asking badly. This is a plan, built over months, that specifically depended on you never finding out how thoroughly it had already been decided without you. That's not a family being awkward about a big ask. That's a family that never intended to give you a real choice in the first place." I sat with that assessment for a long time after we hung up, understanding that I'd needed to hear it from someone entirely outside my family's orbit before I could fully trust my own read of the situation. I had spent so many years quietly absorbing small dismissals, a birthday overshadowed, an achievement minimized, a decade of learning that my own needs were expected to yield whenever Daniels happened to compete for attention, that I'd nearly talked myself into believing this was simply one more version of that same old pattern, uncomfortable but survivable. Hearing someone name it plainly as the deliberate, months-long plan it actually was gave me a different kind of clarity than my own anger alone had managed to produce. If you've ever needed an outside voice to confirm that what you were experiencing wasn't an overreaction, but an accurate read of something genuinely calculated, comment, "Outside perspective changes everything" below. I reached out to a family law attorney the following week, not because I expected this to become a legal matter exactly, but because I wanted to understand, clearly, what my actual rights and exposure looked like if my family attempted to pressure me into any informal financial arrangement once I'd made my refusal explicit. "You're wise to get ahead of this," she told me, reviewing the screenshots Melissa had provided. "Families sometimes attempt to claim verbal agreements were made, particularly around shared living or financial support, even when no such agreement ever existed. Having this documentation, dated and specific, protects you considerably if anyone later tries to claim you'd committed to something you never actually agreed to." I asked her, too, about the broader pattern, whether there was any way to formally address the fact that my mother had been telling extended family, for months, that I'd already agreed to an arrangement I'd never consented to. "That's less a legal question and more a reputational one," she said. "But if you ever want to correct the record publicly, having this kind of clear, dated evidence makes doing so considerably easier and considerably harder for anyone to dispute. I left that meeting with more than legal clarity. I left with the beginning of an actual plan, not simply refusing quietly and hoping the pressure eventually stopped, but preparing to correct, plainly and with proof, exactly what my family had spent months trying to construct behind my back. If you've ever gone looking for legal clarity and come away instead with the first real outline of how you were finally going to stand up for yourself, comment, "That's when the plan became real," below. Chapter 3 is where I stop hoping they'll reconsider and start preparing to make sure they can't talk their way around any of this. The pressure escalated considerably over the following month. Once my family understood, I wasn't simply going to fall in line the way they'd clearly expected. My mother began calling almost daily, each conversation opening with some version of concern for Jessica's exhaustion before pivoting, inevitably, toward a fresh angle of guilt. My Aunt Carol, who'd apparently been told for months that I'd already agreed, called to say she was disappointed to hear I was making things so difficult for Daniel's family, a phrase that told me exactly how thoroughly my mother had already shaped the narrative before I'd ever had the chance to correct it myself. "You're being incredibly selfish," my mother told me during one particularly difficult call. "This family has always shown up for each other. I raised you better than this, Emma." "You raised me to build a life of my own," I said, keeping my voice level despite the specific physical tightness building in my chest. "I don't understand why that's suddenly a character flaw the moment it's inconvenient for Daniel." If you've ever had a parent reframe your own independence as a moral failing the moment it stopped being convenient for someone else, comment, "That reversal is exhausting," below. This is where things finally broke. My father called me separately that same week, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic weight, and for one brief moment I let myself hope he might finally be the one to break from the family's script. "I don't think you're being selfish," he said quietly. "I've thought that from the start. I just don't know how to say that to your mother without starting a fight I don't have the energy for." "Dad, this isn't about starting a fight," I said. "It's about telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. I've never once asked you to fight Mom on my behalf. I've just needed you to stop quietly agreeing with something you don't actually believe." He didn't have an answer for that, and the call ended in the same familiar, disappointing silence I'd grown used to over 30 years of watching my father choose peace with my mother over honesty with me. I understood, hanging up, that whatever support I was going to get through this, it wasn't going to come from him directly, not in any form that actually mattered. If you've ever had a parent privately agree with you while publicly enabling the very thing hurting you, comment, "That's its own kind of betrayal," below. The darkest stretch came 3 weeks later at a smaller family gathering for my grandmother's birthday, when Daniel, apparently no longer willing to let my refusal sit quietly, addressed the entire table directly. "I think everyone should know Emma's decided she's too busy with her career to help family," he said, his voice carrying a wounded, performative quality, clearly calibrated for an audience. "I guess some people just care more about themselves than their own nephew." I felt my jaw tighten, the same physical response I recognize in donors right before they walk away from a table entirely, and I watched several relatives' faces shift toward me with expressions I hadn't anticipated needing to defend against: disappointment, quiet judgment, the particular discomfort of people who had already decided, based on months of my mother's careful narrative shaping, exactly which sibling was the villain in this story. "That's not what happened, and you know it," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. I was never asked. I was informed, after the fact, that I'd already agreed to something I never once discussed. "Don't twist this into something it isn't," my mother said sharply, and I understood, watching the table's collective expression settle firmly against me, despite everything I'd just said, exactly how much ground I'd already lost simply by not being the one controlling the narrative for the past 2 months. My grandmother, turning 90 that day, looked at me with a specific confusion that hurt more than Daniel's performance had. An old woman who had known me my entire life, now uncertain in the space of one dinner. Whether the granddaughter she'd always been proud of had actually turned selfish somewhere along the way. I understood, watching that confusion settle onto her face, exactly how much damage months of a carefully managed narrative could do, even to a relationship built on decades of genuine affection. If you've ever tried to correct months of someone else's narrative in a single sentence, at a table already primed against you, comment that uphill battle is brutal below. I want to be honest about how close I came to giving in that night, the same honesty I owe anyone hearing this account. Watching my grandmother's confused, disappointed glance in my direction, watching cousins I'd grown up with exchange quiet, judgmental looks, feeling the full weight of an entire family's disapproval directed at me for refusing something I'd never actually agreed to. Some old, exhausted part of me nearly opened my mouth to simply apologize, to offer some diminished version of help, just to make the discomfort in that room stop. I thought, in that moment, about every year I'd spent absorbing smaller versions of exactly this pressure, learning that peace in this family had always been available to me at the cost of my own boundaries, and never at the cost of anyone else's convenience. I thought about the screenshot sitting in my private folder, Daniel's exact words about groceries and electricity, Jessica's message calling me a saved daycare cost, my mother's casual dismissal of my entire life to my Aunt Carol months before I'd ever been consulted. I understood, sitting at that table with my jaw still tight and my grandmother's confused eyes still on me, that giving in that night would have confirmed, permanently, that this family's comfort would always outweigh my own reality, regardless of how much proof I eventually gathered. I didn't apologize. I sat through the rest of that dinner in a silence that clearly unsettled everyone more than an argument would have. And I drove home afterward with a clarity that finally, fully displaced the last of my hesitation. If you've ever come within a single sentence of giving in to years of accumulated guilt, and found, at the very last moment, the resolve not to comment, I know how close that was, below. I stopped hoping, somewhere in the drive home from that birthday dinner,
that this family might ever simply reconsider on their own, without needing to be shown, plainly and undeniably, exactly what they'd actually built behind my back. I thought about Daniel's performance at that table, wounded and public, designed specifically to turn an entire room against me, rather than simply have an honest conversation between siblings. I thought about my mother's sharp, immediate defense of that performance, prioritizing the story she'd already told everyone over the actual truth sitting in my own phone. I understood, driving home that night, exactly what infrastructure, not family, actually meant in practice. I had spent 29 years being useful to this family in every way that cost me something and benefited them. A promotion celebrated in passing before the conversation pivoted back to Daniel's needs. A house bought entirely on my own labor while my brother's was gifted to him. An entire adult life built independently and then dismissed in a single dinner conversation as not real, the moment it became inconvenient for someone else's comfort. I had never, not once, been treated as someone whose actual consent mattered as much as the family's need for a convenient solution. I called Melissa the next morning and asked her to help me confirm a date. My parents' upcoming 40th anniversary celebration, 3 weeks away, a gathering large enough that nearly the entire extended family, including everyone who'd already been told I'd agreed to this plan, would be in the same room together. I want everyone there, I told her. everyone who's already heard the version where I'm the selfish one. I think it's time they heard the version that's actually true. Melissa agreed to help, and over the following days we worked together, quietly, organizing every screenshot into a clear chronological presentation, the same careful methodology I use building a case for a major donor. Nothing exaggerated, nothing added, simply the plain, undeniable sequence of my family's own words laid out in the order they'd actually been written. Melissa also reached out, carefully, to a few other relatives she trusted, people she suspected might have quietly sensed something was off about the whole arrangement without ever having proof of their own. "You don't have to convince everyone," she told me one evening as we worked. "You just have to make it impossible for anyone who still wants to believe the old version to keep believing it honestly." I thought about that phrase for a long time after our conversation ended, understanding that she'd articulated something I hadn't quite found words for myself yet, that this was never going to be about winning over every single relative in that room. It was going to be about removing, permanently, the plausible deniability my mother had spent months carefully constructing, so that anyone who chose to keep siding with her afterward would at least be doing so with full knowledge of what they were actually endorsing. If you've ever realized that changing every mind in the room was never actually the goal, just removing anyone's ability to pretend they hadn't been told the truth, comment that distinction matters below. I spent the week before the anniversary celebration in a strange focused calm I hadn't expected to feel. The same steady clarity that settles over me before a major funding presentation once all the preparation is finally behind me and only the delivery remains. I rehearsed nothing dramatic, no speech designed for maximum emotional impact. I simply organized the evidence clearly enough that it could speak for itself, the same way the strongest fundraising cases I'd ever built had never needed embellishment, only honest, well-organized proof. My mother called twice that week, her voice carrying a new note of unease I hadn't heard from her before, as though some instinct had started warning her that my silence over the past few weeks meant something other than quiet defeat. "Are you coming to the anniversary party?" she asked, the second time with a carefulness that told me she was probing for reassurance rather than simply confirming logistics. "I wouldn't miss it," I told her, and I meant that more literally than she understood. I spent the night before the party reviewing every screenshot one final time, checking dates, confirming context, making certain that nothing I planned to show that room could be dismissed as taken out of context or misunderstood. I thought about my grandmother's confused, disappointed glance at that birthday dinner, and I understood that whatever happened the following evening, I owed her, at minimum, the clarity of finally understanding what had actually happened, rather than the carefully managed version she'd been given so far. If you've ever answered a loaded question with a technically true statement that carried a very different meaning than the person asking assumed, comment. I did that.
2. Below. Chapter 4 is where I finally show all of them exactly what they built without me. The anniversary party filled my parents' backyard with nearly 60 relatives, string lights strung between the trees, the same warm, celebratory atmosphere my mother had spent weeks preparing with the same careful, image-conscious attention she'd brought to every family milestone I could remember. I waited until after the toasts, after the cake, once most of the extended family had settled into the comfortable, unhurried portion of the evening, before I asked my mother, quietly, if I could say a few words. She agreed, visibly pleased, clearly assuming I intended some warm, sentimental tribute to 40 years of marriage. I connected my phone to the small speaker system Daniel had set up for the toasts earlier, and I began, calmly, without raising my voice, the same measured, professional register I use presenting a case to a room full of skeptical donors. "Before I say anything else, I want everyone here to see something," I said, "because for the past few months, I've been told, repeatedly, by people in this family, that I was being selfish for refusing to become an unpaid live-in nanny for Daniel and Jessica's household. I want you all to see exactly what was actually being planned, in their own words, months before I was ever consulted. If you've ever watched a room's entire mood shift in a single sentence, understanding something enormous was about to be revealed, comment, 'The room went still,' below. This is the reveal." I projected the screenshots directly onto a portable screen Melissa had helped me set up earlier that afternoon, disguised among the party's other rented equipment, and I walked the gathered family through each one, methodically, exactly the way I'd rehearsed. Daniel's message about the guest suite and the mortgage savings. My mother's dismissive comment to my Aunt Carol about how I didn't have kids of her own to worry about. Jessica's message calling me, in effect, a saved daycare expense. The specific line about groceries and electricity being fair to expect from someone living in a house that wasn't hers. The backyard, which had been humming with the easy, unhurried noise of a family celebration, went entirely silent. The specific, total silence of nearly 60 people simultaneously understanding that the story they'd been told for months bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. I watched my Aunt Carol's face shift from confusion into something considerably more uncomfortable, watched several cousins glance toward Daniel and Jessica with expressions that had, moments earlier, been reserved entirely for me. "This is completely out of context," Daniel said, his voice rising, though something in his face told a different story than his words did. The specific, frozen stillness of a man realizing, in real time, that a carefully managed narrative had just become unrecoverable. "You're twisting private conversations." "These are your exact words, Daniel," I said, keeping my voice level. "Dated, time-stamped, and entirely consistent with each other. I'm not twisting anything. I'm simply showing everyone what was actually decided about my life, months before anyone bothered to ask me." If you've ever watched someone try to reframe their own documented words as out of context, while the room could see plainly they weren't, comment, "The silence says everything," below. My mother's composure, watching those screenshots scroll past, had fractured considerably from the bright, celebratory warmth she'd carried all evening. "Emma, this is not the time or place," she started. "You made it the time and place, months ago, when you told Aunt Carol and who knows how many other relatives that I'd already agreed to this before I'd ever heard a single word about it," I said. "You made it the time and place when Daniel stood up at Grandma's birthday and told everyone I was too selfish to care about my own nephew. I'm simply finishing the conversation you all started without me." My grandmother, sitting near the front of the small gathered crowd, looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in her expression from the confused disappointment I'd seen at her own birthday weeks earlier into something closer to genuine understanding. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner, sweetheart?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying real hurt. "I wanted proof strong enough that no one could argue with it," I told her. "I didn't want this to become my word against theirs. I wanted everyone to see exactly what happened, in their own writing, so there'd be no room left to pretend otherwise. If you've ever finally gotten to say, in front of everyone who judged you unfairly, the truth you'd been carrying quietly for months, comment, that release must have felt enormous, below. The party did not recover its earlier warmth for the remainder of that evening. Several relatives approached me privately over the following hour, some apologizing directly for having believed the version they'd been given, others simply quiet, clearly recalibrating months of assumptions in real time. My Aunt Carol found me near the dessert table, her expression carrying genuine embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she said. I should have asked you directly instead of just believing what your mother told me. That was wrong of me." "Thank you for saying that," I told her, and I meant it. Understanding that an apology offered without being forced meant considerably more than anything I could have extracted through confrontation alone. Daniel and Jessica left the party early, and my mother spent the remainder of the evening in a controlled, brittle silence that told me, more clearly than any argument could have, exactly how much she understood about what had just happened to a narrative she'd spent months carefully constructing. The weeks that followed brought a reckoning considerably larger than I'd expected when I first started building that evidence folder. Daniel and Jessica, unable to rely on the free labor and housing they'd quietly planned around for months, were forced to actually budget for childcare. An adjustment that apparently required some uncomfortable conversations with their own finances they'd clearly been hoping to avoid entirely. My mother's relationship with several extended family members cooled considerably, not because anyone sought to punish her directly, but because trust, once demonstrably broken, doesn't simply reset on its own timeline. My father called me alone, a few days after the party, his voice carrying something closer to genuine reflection than I'd heard from him in years. "I should have said something sooner," he told me. "I knew it wasn't right. I just didn't want to fight your mother about it. I'm sorry I let you carry that alone." "I appreciate you saying that now," I told him honestly, "but I need you to understand that agreeing with me privately, while still going along with everything publicly, isn't actually support. If you want a real relationship with me going forward, it needs to include you actually saying something, out loud, when it matters." He didn't have an immediate answer for that, and I understood that whatever repair was possible between us would take considerably longer than a single honest phone call, though I appreciated at least that he'd finally made it. My mother reached out twice in the weeks that followed, each conversation carrying a different version of the same underlying request, that I let this go for the sake of the family, that airing things so publicly had gone too far, that surely, now that everyone understood how upset I'd been, we could simply move forward, as though the humiliation of that evening had been punishment enough for whatever she'd actually done. "I'm not interested in moving forward until there's an actual accounting of what happened," I told her during the second of those calls. Not a request that I let it go. An acknowledgement from you that you spent months telling extended family I'd agreed to something I never once discussed, and that doing so was wrong, regardless of how uncomfortable it might have gotten once the truth came out. She didn't offer that acknowledgement, not on that call, and not on several that followed. I understood eventually that whatever accountability I was hoping for from my mother specifically might never actually arrive in the form I wanted it, and I made peace, slowly, with the possibility that some relationships repair only partially, or not at all, regardless of how much evidence eventually forces the truth into the open. If you've ever had to accept that even undeniable proof doesn't guarantee the accountability you were hoping for, comment, "The truth coming out isn't the same as an apology," below. I permanently cut off financial contact with my parents and with Daniel's household. In the months that followed, not out of anger, but out of the same clear-eyed understanding I'd built the entire case around, that a family relationship built on my usefulness rather than my actual well-being wasn't a relationship worth financially subsidizing any further. I kept my house, kept my career, and used part of my savings the following year to finally buy the small vacation property I'd been quietly saving toward for years, a decision I'd once delayed indefinitely out of some vague, unexamined sense that my own wants mattered less than everyone else's needs. I started, that same year, informally mentoring younger women in my nonprofits network who described eerily similar patterns in their own families. The golden child sibling, the parent who treated a daughter's independence as an inconvenience rather than an achievement, the slow, accumulating realization that being called the strong one had never actually been a compliment. I didn't have a formal program, not at first, just coffee conversations and honest advice. But watching other women recognize the same pattern I'd spent 29 years failing to name felt like the clearest possible use of everything that ordeal had cost me. Melissa remained one of my closest relationships in the family that followed. Our friendship deepened, rather than complicated by everything we'd built together that spring. "I'm proud of you," she told me months later, over the same kind of coffee that had once helped me survive the worst of it. Not just for exposing what happened, for knowing exactly when enough evidence was enough and not letting it turn into something crueler than it needed to be. I thought about that observation for a long time afterward, understanding that she'd named something important about the entire process, that I'd never actually wanted to destroy my family, only to make it impossible for them to keep pretending my life didn't matter as much as everyone else's convenience. I didn't get revenge. In the end, not in the way the version of me sitting frozen at that dinner table might have once imagined wanting it. I got something quieter, and I've come to understand it as considerably more valuable. I got the truth, confirmed, in front of everyone who judged me unfairly, in a form no one could ever again talk me out of. I got my life back, entirely my own, no longer available to be quietly budgeted around by people who had never actually asked whether I wanted to be included in their plans. And I got the clear, permanent understanding that family, built correctly, protects the people inside it. It never treats them as a resource to be managed. The greatest victory was never going to be watching my family's plans collapse. It was understanding finally that my own life had always been real, whether or not anyone else in that family was ever willing to see it that way. The end.